just give you some of my reflections on the importance of this group. So as Brian said, the Research Institute's been going through this massive strategic planning process, faculty-driven. I'm actually going to share just a couple of results from a survey that was done in March, April. This was presented to the Research Council at the end of April. This was our attempt to try to hear from as many faculty as possible. Just some basic impressions about priorities for the Research Institute, both administratively as well as scientifically. And to do a check-in on the two major organizational entities to support research that the Research Institute supports, centers of emphasis and research affinity groups. And so let me just share some results of this survey with you, and then I'll give you some of my reflections and maybe a charge to your affinity group, because timing is everything in life. And Linda's here. Linda Miller is leading an effort on a part of the hospital for the hospital to develop a digital health strategy. And thankfully, that strategy will incorporate research. This is going to be one of the times that when CHOP does something from the beginning, from day one, we're going to integrate education, research, and clinical care all together. And I'm a member of the steering committee, and so we'll try to be the eyes and ears of this community to that process. One thing I would suggest that we talked a little bit about is the hospital's calling this digital health. We're calling this mHealth. We're actually talking about the same thing. So it doesn't make sense to me to have two different terms in the same institution refer to the same thing, and that will likely perpetuate a sense of confusion. So I would strongly ask the group to consider aligning your label with the hospital label, which maybe to the uninitiated is a little bit more immediately, intuitively obvious what you're talking about. But anyway, that's just something for the group to consider. So I know some of you responded to this survey. It was sent to all research scientists and then all faculty at CHOP in the various academic tracks. There were over 700 invitations sent out and 258 respondents. Don't focus too much on the relatively low response rate, because many AC track faculty don't do research, so the survey wasn't relevant to them, but we didn't try to call that out. And we got good numbers of folks kind of in each, both research scientists, 56 of them, as well as almost 200 faculty scattered across the various academic tracks to respond. So I felt like we at least heard from the major constituency groups of investigators at CHOP. If you look at the faculty, it was a decent mix of, junior to senior folks across all three ranks. And they came from most departments. Pediatrics dominates at CHOP. It's by far and away the largest department, just by terms of faculty headcount. But we at least heard from a couple folks from really every department in the institution. And among the research scientists who didn't align themselves with a department per se, they're actually a reasonably experienced group of folks, on average being here about 6 to 7 years. And when we asked people to characterize the type of research they did, again, not surprisingly at CHOP, in case you didn't know, we do a broad range of research here. We do everything from soup to nuts. The soup folks, the basic science, are outnumbered by the clinical and translational researchers. And people could label their research in more than one way. So, there may be some epi folks who are also doing clinical trials or vice versa. But again, I think the point is we're running across the spectrum. And the way, I think I've mentioned this to your leadership here, but I just want all of you to hear it. This is my perspective on digital health as a research tool. I think of it as an epidemiologist and a population health researcher as a tool not unlike CRISPR and gene editing is to the basic scientists. So they have their tools, which is whole exome sequencing and I don't know, what are they, Brian? Like transgenomic mice models and CRISPR-Cas gene. That's what they do. This is what we do. Like on the clinical population health prevention end of research, I consider digital health tools to be major advances for the future of supporting the kind of research that we want to be engaged in at CHOP. So, and I think in the strategic plan, there's clearly an emphasis on we need to continue to invest in and develop our basic researchers, because that's where a lot of really novel, innovative discovery comes from. But that's not at the expense of continuing to invest in and support our population health prevention-oriented researchers. We believe they're both important, we're large enough, and we're well-resourced enough to support that entire spectrum. So just a couple notes. So centers of emphasis, some of you are probably in them. I don't know that anybody can interpret all of those mnemonics. I practiced it this morning. I think I got it. But probably in this room, Policy Lab, CPC, SERP would be the biggies, I would guess. Maybe autism, cancer. And just keep in mind that centers of emphasis are like real physical places. Like they have doors and offices and, you know, labels on the wall. And so not surprisingly, most people that are in them consider it their academic home. It's the site of their research. And sort of in contrast to that, research affinity groups are more virtual in nature. So you guys won't ever sit together in an office area. You'll come together like this. There are, I think there's 12 or 13 research affinity groups, the vast majority of which lean towards the basic and basic translational side of that research spectrum. Until this group, so mHealth is here, and there were 10 respondents to the survey who said they were in the mHealth research affinity group, which was quite remarkable. Because it hadn't existed really until this moment. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. But the health and behavior RAG is obviously a very large research affinity group, very active, very engaged. Some of you may be members of that one as well. That one leans towards the clinical population health side, but really pediatric nursing does as well. But for the most part, these things lean more towards the other end of the spectrum. So I would predict that we may have another couple of key research affinity groups that need to be developed to support the more population prevention end of the spectrum. And I'm really excited about this one because, again, I think it's a really exciting tool. But first of all, if you said you were in an affinity group, on average, you actually said you were in 1.5 affinity groups. So every 2 people said they were in 3. So you can belong to multiple affinity groups. So they're not mutually exclusive. And most folks who say they belong say they're regular, you know, active participants. Some are occasional, and some would say, I'm in it, but I rarely do anything in it. And don't get too lost in the details here. We went through for both centers and affinity groups and just asked, so what does this group do for you? And so this first one is it helps me meet investigators with whom I can collaborate. And all the groups, you know, we sorted their members on a 5-point Likert scale. And I've got these ordered with the things that the affinity group mostly does down to what it least does. So it mostly helps me meet investigators with whom I can collaborate. And I can tell you already, look, the mHealth group sort of tracks with all the other groups. So, you know, I guess 7 out of 10 either agreed or strongly agreed with that even before the first meeting took place. So, like, that's remarkable. Stimulates new research ideas for me. Again, most would agree or strongly agree with that. Keeps me up to date on developments in my field, still kind of leaning more towards agree and strongly agree. But now you get to provides administrative or other support to my work that is not provided by my grants. Not so much for affinity groups. Provides access to specialized resources to support my research. Not so much for affinity groups. And that's okay. That's not a problem. That's not, they were really designed to do those first 3 things, to bring like-minded people together, to stimulate thinking, share ideas, create new collaborations, provide, you know, experience, particularly in this area because, you know, we know that people have reinvented the wheel over and over again, not realizing that there was someone else in the institution who'd already had experience doing that. And that I would love to see that end as quickly as possible. So at the very least, I hope that this group is an opportunity for you guys to start sharing your experience. Well, I did it this way. Maybe you should try this vendor I used before, whatever. Now, the one message I'll leave you with is on this issue of provides access to specialized resources. So again, this is not typically a goal for an affinity group. But in our very earliest discussions about creating this group, it became pretty clear that one big question CHOP has to answer is, well, what kind of resources should we have in-house to support this kind of work versus where do we stop and then sort of say, look, that's the kind of stuff you got to use an outside vendor for. And I'll just, for me personally, that it's not intuitively obvious where that dividing line is. And so I'm looking to the group to provide, some unanimity of voice in terms of a recommendation for what are the most important resources that you all need to support the work you do, and help us think about, well, what would it take for us to support that internally at CHOP versus where can we maybe help you create a preferred vendor list and vet vendors for you and facilitate the process of working with outside vendors. Because this space, things are constantly changing. And I think companies come and go, literally overnight. So I think we're careful about where we might invest as a hospital in this area, but it may make sense for us to do that in some really thoughtful way. So for me personally, in my role, I'm going to be looking to the group to provide some information on that we can use to make some decisions. Any questions about any of that? These are early days for the affinity group, which are exciting days. There's so much to talk about. You guys will have to decide how you want to organize your conversations, but that's one issue. Besides just bringing you all together to stimulate ideas, which is what we're really about here, there are some practical issues that we need some advice, guidance on from the group. And rather than me trying to track down 60 of you and hear 60 different opinions, it'd be a lot easier for you guys to vet some of that stuff here and maybe come forward with, one voice.